I have picked 4 artists, 4 painters, which I think are the most representative of the style. And I'm going to give you a very brief introduction into each one of them. So we're going to start with Henri Toulouse-Lautrec and his flaneur. I'm going to explain what that is. We're going to talk about Vincent van Gogh, who is the romantic of the movement, Paul Gauguin, who is the mystic, and we will round this up with Paul Cézanne, who is the architect. Cézanne is probably the most difficult to explain, especially in the 20 minutes that I have. So, but I will try to do him justice. So for those of you who have taken my classes, this is a very familiar slide because this is the slide I start all of my 19th century movements with. And if you've taken my class, you know I always start with the historical context. So we find ourselves in the second half of the 19th century, in the period of the first bourgeois republic. And this is the modern France. So for the country of France, 19th century is a very long period because a lot of things happened in the 19th century. Right at the edge of it, they beheaded the king and queen of France, and thereby started a series of revolutions and a series of republics. So after the first Great Revolution and the First Republic, we very famously have the second, you have Napoleon Bonaparte being in charge of France, right? So that's the first empire after the royal France. Then Napoleon is famously defeated. You have a brief restoration of the royal line. You have then a sort of in exchange of the monarchy, you have Louis Philippe coming to the throne. Then you have the revolution of 1848. And then you have another Napoleon who becomes in charge of the country. And his name is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. And so since they again overthrew the monarchy, this is now the Second Republic, and they elect Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. So he becomes the president, very popular guy. In no small way, his popularity originates from his last name, obviously. Just like his illustrious predecessor, Louis Napoleon decides that he is not satisfied with the title of the president. He dissolves the National Assembly and he becomes the emperor. So this is the Second Empire. And this is the first modern bourgeois regime. So he is the emperor, but this is a bourgeois sort of empire. And he answers the demands of the upper middle class. It's a stable society. It's a prosperous society. It ends because he gets involved, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte gets involved in this horrible war with Prussia. He is captured and exiled to London. There is a siege of Paris. There is the Paris Commune uprising. And from 1870, we have the Third Republic, which lasts up until 1940. So it starts with the Prussians and it sort of ends with the Germans that time. In 1940, and there is a series of presidents, but again, it's a very stable society, prosperous society, very well off, rapidly industrializing modern France, modern republic. So the period from 1871 to First World War, 1914, is also called the Belle Epoque, the beautiful time. And that, of course, is a moniker that is put on that period after World War I, looking back with nostalgia at the time of stability. So the Second Industrial Revolution, which also is happening during this time, means that new industries are popping up. There are these newfangled inventions that make the world smaller, like the telegraph and the telephone. Railroads are now crisscrossing France just like they are in America during this period. With that comes this new industry, which is the tourist industry. The middle class now can afford, even the working class can afford a train ticket and going to the beach on the weekend. And what they also can afford, because there is more of a working class, because the industries are growing, they can also afford to buy things. So this is the beginning of the culture of the mass consumer and mass production, which we're still sort of in that era. But with all of that stability, with all of that wealth, this is not, it's not smooth sailing. There are sort of fissures and fractures underneath the Belle Epoque era. So there is a poster on your slide on the bottom. There's this little guy in an imperial getup, and he's blowing these very fragile bubbles. Each one of them says something that people have illusions of: wealth, order, tranquility, glory, prosperity. So people do feel this fin de siècle melancholy, the sort of how easy it is for the world to fall apart. So why is this happening? Well, the society, the Western civilization is changing, right? So this is capitalist bourgeois society. The industry is growing, which means the working class is growing, which means they're now becoming a political power and an economic power, but they have these horrible working conditions. Nobody's working 8-hour days. There are no child labor laws. There is no health inspection. So all of these things are actually being developed in the 19th century. So there is urban strife. There is this class struggle. Karl Marx is writing during this period, you know, going off of the real things, the real problems in the society. And then, of course, you have this huge reactionary movement to the modernization. There is a resurgence in this brand of Catholicism that's all about the visions and the mystical sort of apparitions. People are starting to get interested in the occult. It's always a sort of you know, the counter reaction to new technology and to new inventions. And then, of course, France specifically during the later part of the 19th century is grappling with this question: are we going to be a republic that will treat our citizens equally under the law, or are we going to be a Catholic state? And the case that is the most famous case that is part of that struggle is the case of the Jewish military officer, the Dreyfus affair, where an innocent man is accused and condemned to prison because they proclaim him to be a spy, all the evidence notwithstanding. He's innocent, but it takes from 1894 to 1906 to acquit him. And all the great minds of the time get involved, like Emile Zola, for example, writes this very famous article that starts each paragraph with "I accuse, j'accuse," and he accuses the state and the middle class of the hypocrisy and the complacency and anti-Semitism. So this is a turbulent time, but a wealthy time. So this is the political context. What is happening in Paris is very much a reflection of what is happening in the larger French society. It is rapidly modernizing. Louis Napoleon asks one of his ministers by the name of Baron Haussmann to basically rebuild the city. So the city that we know as Paris now did not look like that before 1850s, because the center of Paris was very much medieval, narrow streets, cobblestone streets, where you can get a rock and build a barricade, right? And fight back if the establishment is coming to your street. Because of all the revolutions, because of all the barricades, this was not considered, you know, an ideal status quo. So Baron Haussmann, whose nickname afterwards was the Demolisher, Baron Haussmann the Demolisher, basically destroys the historic center of Paris, puts in these apartment buildings that we see now, right, in this very expensive area of Paris, the straight and wide boulevards, builds the green spaces. So the urban parks are an invention of the 19th century, like the Central Park in New York, built around the same time. In Paris, we also have now the new opera house, the racetrack, but the boulevards are really what influences the modern art the most, because you now have this straight and wide avenue of vision, right? Because these wide and straight boulevards are easily sort of decoded in terms of what you see. And so the modern art movement, the first modern art movement, the Impressionism, takes the subject of the modern city and runs with it. It is not an industrial city, right? All the industry has been pushed out to the outskirts, like to the Montmartre, or even further away. All the poor people have been pushed out. What you have in the center is a lot of shopping and a lot of fashionably dressed men, mostly men, because women do not walk the streets of a certain, women of a certain class have to have a companion with them. So you have these flaneurs, which translates as a strollaby or a boulevardier, because they walk the boulevards or they ride in carriages on the boulevards, and they look very quickly, but they are all looking. It's not an industrial center, as I said, it's a commercial center, and there's a lot of window shopping and there's a lot of people watching. So the act of looking and being looked at becomes the subject matter of Impressionism. So you get paintings like here, Gustave Caillebotte, which look like a snapshot, right? It's not a centralized composition. It's not a symmetrical composition. It's something it's a glimpse out of the corner of your eye, ostensibly accidentally cropped and framed, and at these oblique angles. So for the Impressionist movement, the fleeting moment becomes the modern moment. That is the subject matter. Modernity as a fleeting snapshot. And light, which is what Impressionists are painting, the effects of light, becomes a metaphor of that modernity, of that moment. So the Impressionists arrive on the scene in 1860s, and about 20 years later, in 1880s, there is the so-called crisis of Impressionism. You have a new group of artists who do not call themselves post-impressionism. They don't call themselves anything, or they call themselves different names like symbolists or neo-impressionists. But they come after the Impressionists, and they're not satisfied with what the Impressionists had accomplished. They want to go further. And the biggest difference that they are talking about is this idea of fleetingness that you have in Impressionism. So on your left is an example of an Impressionist artist, the most famous one, Claude Monet. His most famous work probably from 1872. And you have here a moment captured and the light captured, right? This is the sun setting, and you have the specific effect of sun as it interacts and reflects with different surfaces, mostly with the water, right? How is this painting constructed? You don't have a lot of structure, right? It's hard to say where the foreground, the middle ground, and the background is. Everything sort of melds together. What you do have is this spontaneous looking brushwork, staccato broken brushwork. And what Impressionists sort of brought to the scene are these contemporary theories of optics, like optical mixing, this idea that you don't need to physically mix the color on your palette to make another color, but you can put two colors next to each other and step away, and the colors will mix in your eye. They call it optical mixing. For example, if you put yellow and green together, you get blue, right? You can do it physically by mixing green and yellow on the palette, or you can put a smudge of green next to a smudge of yellow, step back, and theoretically it will become blue in your eye. And the idea is that not mixing the colors physically lets the colors remain, lets the colors remain bright and luminous. It's all about the luminosity, right, of pigment. Another thing they introduce is called a complementary contrast, meaning on the color wheel, colors that are opposite of each other, like green and red, if you put them next to each other, the perception that the viewer has is that they are brighter. So you have the contrasting colors put next to each other. So this is what we have, what we're looking at in the Impressionism. It's this objective approach to representation. They're going off of the theories of optics, of physics. So in their mind, this is a very objective observation of the world. And it's the effervescence of the moment, the fleeting second that they capture in paint. The post-impressionism, like Paul Cézanne here, are not satisfied with that objective. Their objective becomes to present a painting that will convey something of significance. So the opposite of the fleetingness, they want something enduring. And so that's the commonality in the post-impressionism. And we're going to see how each of them defines what enduring is. And the other thing is that they abandon this objectivity of observation, of representation, and they concentrate on the subjective feeling about nature, the subjective feeling about yourself, the individual take on reality. So they keep the other things, the formal things that the Impressionists had introduced, like the broken brushwork, like the complementary contrasts. So the first artist that we're going to look at is this guy. His name is Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, and he is born in Albi in the French Empire, and he dies in Saint-André-du-Bois in France. And he comes from one of the most noble families in France, a very, very ancient aristocratic family, which has this tradition, as a lot of families with royal blood has, of marrying cousins. So it's a tradition that really doesn't contribute to the health of the family in the long run. And tragically, that's the case with Henri. We don't know what the diagnosis is, but most likely it has something to do with the absorption of calcium. So his bones are very fragile. When he is a teenager, he breaks one of his legs, then 1 year later, he breaks another one of his legs. I mean, the other one, he only has two. He never grows beyond 5 feet, and he always walks with a cane, and most likely always in some amount of pain. So this is somebody who is dealing with a lot of physical discomfort. He is frequently in bed, and he begins drawing just to pass the time. Where he gets lucky is one of his father's friends is this very successful painter, but he is also physically challenged. He is mute and he is deaf, but he has this really, really successful career. So Henri decides to model himself after his first teacher. He comes to Paris in 1882. He studies at 2 studios there of the academic painters, and he paints these very muddy, sort of brownish paintings until he goes to the Impressionist exhibition. It's the 7th Impressionist exhibition. And after that visit, his style completely changes. He takes up modern subjects. His palette becomes lighter. He adopts this very sort of bravura brushwork. And he also goes to the Japanese, to the exhibition of Japanese art. So, and he also meets photographers during this time. So all of these things become sources for his paintings. He is the closest out of the painters that we're going to be talking about today. He is the closest to Impressionism, and he is a huge fan of Edgar Degas. They're very, very similar in terms of their subject matter, in terms of their attitudes. So how do you recognize Toulouse-Lautrec if you're in a museum and you don't know what you're looking at? If you have a painting from the 19th century that is done on a cardboard, that's Toulouse-Lautrec. He will use cardboard, he will use whatever is near to him, basically, as a support. He simplifies forms. He is very sketchy in terms of his brushwork, very bright, incredibly saturated colors, flat color, areas of color bounded by strong outlines, cropping, oblique viewpoints, and urban subject matter. He doesn't paint peasants. He doesn't paint landscapes. It's always figures, and it's always urban types. So prostitutes, circus performers, flaneurs, and entertainers. So a couple of words about his sources, because they are the sources for all of the post-impressionists, really. So there is the first formal exhibition that happens in Paris of Japanese art, and it is possible because Japan opens its doors to the West. Japan is an insulated, closed country for the majority of its life, but in the 19th century, it decides to join, to sort of allow this interchange, and there is this influx of Japanese art objects into the Western countries, specifically into France, that we're talking about here. So you have silk, you have porcelain, you have Japanese dolls. Most importantly, for the development of Western art is basically the wrapping paper in which these objects come in. They wrap the fans and the porcelain in these cheaply made woodcut prints called ukiyo-e. And that wrapping paper changes the Western art aesthetic, because for the first time, Western artists see in this sort of large quantities, they discover that they don't have to paint like the Renaissance artists did. They don't have to follow the rules of linear perspective. You don't need to have a perspective at all. It can be, the space can be arranged in a different manner. You can have strong outlines, you can have exaggerated facial expressions, you can crop the image for, pursuing sort of an emotional intensity. You can take not a centralized front and center sort of position as a viewer. You can look at things from an angle, and flatness. You can flatten and simplify things for this, for an effect, for an emotional effect. So on the left is Yvette Gilbert by Toulouse-Lautrec, who is an entertainer, and very obviously what he's looking at is on the right. This is an ukiyo-e, a color woodcut of a kabuki theater artist. And this caricature rising, the simplification, the capturing of the personality in just few strokes is what Lautrec really takes on board. Mostly, I would just say all of what Lautrec does, he is looking at the modern urban spaces, but he is a denizen of Montmartre, this cheaper area on the outskirts of Paris where a lot of artists are renting. Most successful artists rent in one area of Montmartre, less successful in the other, the cheapest one. This is also the area where you have these new popular spaces of urban entertainment, which are the cabarets. Most of them don't open in the city center. Most of them, you have to travel to Montmartre. So this is the Moulin Rouge, the very famous cabaret with the wooden elephant in the backyard. There you have the dancers about to perform. And in the front, you have a mix of classes, because these are the spaces where the bourgeois and the proletariat sort of mixed freely. Of course, there is still that differentiation where the entertainers are from the working class, and most of them are women, and the consumers of that entertainment are the bourgeois men, right, that go slumming. That's the term, to Montmartre. So that is what Lautrec is painting. This is Moulin de la Galette from 1889. This is at the Art Institute of Chicago. And this is another, just like Moulin Rouge, it's this new space of public entertainment where you have crowds of people and mixes of classes. I wanted to put it next to an impressionist who is also, who is here on the right. This is Renoir. He had also painted Moulin de la Galette, but look at the difference. The same space, right, except that it looks like it's outside for Renoir, but it's the same geographical location. It should be the same mix of people, but where in Renoir, it's about capturing the moment that light falls on the pretty ladies' dresses and the fashionable frocks of men here. It's when figures become landscape, they are sort of non-distinguishable. It's about the effect of light, and it's very romantic, very pretty. And then you look at Lautrec, and it's almost like there's a little violin playing in the background. It's very melancholy, it's despairing, and it is conveyed to us through formal means. In Lautrec, there is this very static structure in terms of the composition. It's done on a diagonal, and we can't really walk into the scene. We can here, there's a place open for us, there's a chair turned towards us. Here, we run smack into the bar, and we can't go further. And then the whole of the space is sectioned, and you have these sort of morose-looking bored people at the bar, and then an almost frenzied crowd of dancers in the background. And you have, if you have women with garish makeup, that means they're prostitutes. You have the police over here, and then you have a flaneur in his top hat, the middle-class man who sort of found himself in this space. This is another example of a post-impressionist cabaret. This is at the Moulin Rouge, also at the Art Institute of Chicago. The Moulin Rouge actually opened with Van Gogh's, with Lautrec's painting, this painting in the foyer. So it was like a calling card for the whole space. This is a group portrait, because over here you have Toulouse-Lautrec himself with his cousin. This is an entertainer by the name of May Milton. And you have a group of Lautrec's friends sitting at the table. They should be talking. This is a get-together of friends at night, but they are not even looking at each other. The whole premise is that of alienation in the modern society, in the modern city, where you have a crowd, but you don't have a relationship at all. You're lonely among the masses. What Lautrec truly revolutionizes is this medium of the poster. He is the preeminent artist in the history of poster design. The graphic designers are still studying Lautrec, and he basically invents this new genre of the publicity posters. It's very bright, it's large scale, and it's very easy to read as you travel on these boulevards, because posters are pasted on the houses that line the boulevards of Paris. So they should be like a punch in your face. They should be very easily digestible and sort of leave an imprint on your memory. He gets very, very successful because he works with very successful entertainers that we saw in the cabaret paintings, and he becomes friends with them, and he treats them as equal, and he paints them as equal. But what he does, to put it in modern parlance, is that he helps them to create a brand where you, from his poster, that's almost a caricature, you recognize a personality that has a signature look. So this is Jeanne Avril. That is her signature move, a can-can kick. And on the poster, we recognize her. Even if she wasn't signed for a 19th century visitor to these cabarets, this would be a recognizable brand. Okay, so this is Toulouse-Lautrec in 15 minutes. The next artist is very different. And he is the romantic. This is Vincent van Gogh, and he comes from a very religious family, very strict religious family. His father is a Dutch Reformed minister, but they live in the south of Netherlands, surrounded by a Catholic community. So from the get-go, Vincent feels like he doesn't belong. In his family, there are two professions, really. You either become a clergyman or you become an art dealer, like his younger brother Theo, who supports him for the rest of his life. He fails his exams to become a clergyman, and he starts out as an art dealer, but then is fired, and he takes up drawing. So he is self-taught, but incredibly talented. He moves to Paris, and he attends a studio of Fernand Carmon. Just like Lautrec, he encounters the Impressionism and the Neo-Impressionism, and his colors become lighter and his brushwork becomes more bravura. In 1889, very famously, he lives in the south of France, in Arles, with Gauguin, with Paul Gauguin. They have an infamous argument where Van Gogh has a nervous breakdown and cuts off part of his earlobe. He then voluntarily becomes part of the asylum at Saint-Remy in 1889. Then he doesn't move too far away, but he moves closer to Theo and lives there under the care of Dr. Gachet. And most likely he shoots himself, but there is now a book saying that he's been murdered. There is no evidence to prove it. But 1890, they find him in a wheat field, and he says he shoots himself and he dies some days after. We know a lot about Vincent's methods and about his thoughts because he kept up this very intense correspondence with Theo. He is influenced by the ukiyo-e prints. He is influenced by the Impressionists, and he's also influenced by the Barbizon landscape school of painters that preceded the Impressionism. He's an incredibly prolific artist. There are about 900 paintings and over 1,100 works on paper, but he doesn't sell during his lifetime. Just a few of his works are sold, and as I said, he's supported by family. How would you recognize Van Gogh? Well, you sort of expected to recognize Van Gogh because he's reproduced everywhere. So for him, subjective vision is truth. And the significance in Toulouse-Lautrec, the significant moment is the moment of the modern city and the alienation, the psychological truth of the modern city. For Van Gogh, it is the emotion of that one feels, the spirituality of oneself that he sees as a lasting theme, as a theme of significance, not a fleeting moment. So you recognize him because of the way he paints. He piles up paint. When you pile up pigment, that's called an impasto. It's very dense. He uses this gestural brushwork where you can actually tell how his brush moved across the canvas. Very bright colors, very contrasting combinations, like here, yellow and blue, complementary contrast. And they're very, very rhythmic, his, in terms of shapes, his paintings. And then, of course, he has his own sort of personal language of symbolism, including color. For example, God for him is this blue and yellow, blue and orange, which also stands for summer and light. So there are sort of these personal things that he's looking at. So I just wanted to show this to you, how pervasive Japanese art in terms of its influence was in the 19th century. On your left is Ando Hiroshige, Japanese artist. On your right is Van Gogh's copy of a ukiyo-e print in oil. And he, of course, changes it, and he adds these pseudo-Japanese letters on the perimeter of the painting. And you can, the brushwork is there. You wouldn't have brushwork in ukiyo-e, but he does consider Hiroshige, he says, as a Rembrandt of the East. Van Gogh is incredibly famous as a self-portraitist because he's so interested in the psychology of self and in the emotions, and because it's the cheapest thing to do to paint yourself. So he produces over 43 self-portraits. And so we have sort of a record of his mental states throughout his life, because he doesn't just capture the likeness, he captures the truth of how he's feeling in the moment. This is 1889 self-portrait with bandaged ear. This is the Courtauld Gallery in London. And so I will sort of lay it out for you what it all means. So he cuts off part of his earlobe. He's admitted to the hospital because of the psychotic break, because of the wound, and he is then released. So this is this brief moment when he is released and yet is not yet admitted to the asylum. He comes home. This is his studio. We know this is his studio because there is a canvas on the easel in the background. It's blank. We know he is inside the studio, right? The door is open. He has walked in, but he's wearing his outdoor clothes. He's wearing a winter, it looks like a winter hat and a winter coat. On the other side of him, sort of echoing the black canvas, is the Japanese woodcut print. So this is a commentary on the way he's feeling, right, in the moment. So he's haggard. The color of his skin is sort of this pallid yellow and green. Not the happiest of expressions on his face. He looks emaciated. He looks weak. He looks hopeless and helpless. But what he says, his theory, is that he writes during these moments that he's struggling, he writes to his brother that the act of painting can restore him. So what are we seeing here? He can't paint, the canvas is blank, but on the other side of him is Japanese print that he considers to be the epitome of creation. So while he's standing between the impossibility of painting and the joy of painting, he needs to find strength, the inner strength, to go forth. At this moment, he cannot paint because he is not here as an artist. He is a stranger in his studio. He has walked in not as an artist with the tools of his trade, but just as somebody off of the street. But he leaves that sort of glimpse of hope on our right in the presence of the artwork that he hung on the wall of his studio. So the most famous painting by Van Gogh is The Starry Night. It's of the same year, 1889. It's at the MoMA. And what people don't realize usually is that this is actually part of the series that he does during this period, a series of cypress trees that he does looking out from his room at the asylum. That is what he sees. His movement are constrained at first. They don't trust him to be safe. So he stays, it's a very nice place. It's a former monastery. It has a garden with lavender, and it has these wonderful landscapes that one can see from the window. So he writes during this period that when he is writing to Theo, he says, when he feels a tremendous need for, shall I say the word, for religion, I go outside at night to paint the stars. So this is what we have here by his own admission. This is a painting of his faith, of the spirituality that he's seeking. The swirls of the sky that present the cosmos as a living being. Blue and yellow is his personal symbolist sort of combination that stands for Christ and divine enlightenment. And the cypress, which he described in another letter, is a symbol of, is a tree, a sort of a marker between the land of the living and the land of the dead. So the cypress is a grave marker. The village that you see beyond the cypress did not exist. He invents this village and he adds it here. So if you read it, knowing that he is on the asylum on this side of the tree, right? That's where we're looking from as a viewer. He is in the land of the dead, looking beyond the grave marker onto the land of the living, where the windows are lit and the church is functioning. So people are going on about their day in this imaginary village where he is in the land that is isolated, right? The land of the dead, the sort of the silent, the patients of the asylum. So you have the element of fantasy, of imagination as this village, and you have this invented personal symbolism of color, but then you also have the elements that are real and observable. The cypress tree is there, the sky is there, and that swirl that he is giving us here is actually taken from this photograph of the spiral galaxy that's published in a magazine that Van Gogh reads. So it's a mix of the imaginary and the real that he puts together and gives us this sort of enduring moment of his mental state in that instance. The next artist is Paul Gauguin, which is once again very different. He is a mystic. Oh, that's the name I've given him for this lecture. So he has a very interesting biography. He is born to an exiled journalist, a French journalist who can't stay in Paris because he's so liberal. He has to leave for his personal safety. And he dies en route to Lima, Peru, when Gauguin is 6. They own a ship traveling and his father dies. So his mother sort of stays with the relatives in Peru in this very wealthy household. Her mother, so the mother of Gauguin's mother, is an incredibly famous feminist writer and philosopher who dies before Gauguin is born. So he has these very these huge personalities on both sides of his families. His Peruvian family sort of kicked them out after the death of the patriarch of the family. They have to leave and they come to Paris. They are very poor. Gauguin's mother is a seamstress who takes in jobs. He is sent to the Catholic seminary. He's not a very good student. And after the school, no prospects, no connections, he becomes a merchant marine for 6 years and he travels to Brazil, for example. And then he comes to Paris. There is a relative of his mother there by the name of Gustavo Arosa. And Gauguin becomes a very successful stockbroker. He buys an apartment in the fashionable arrondissement of Paris. He gets married. He has 5 children. And he has enough money to start collecting art. And that is the way he becomes part of the circle of Impressionist painters. And then he becomes a so-called Sunday painter. He goes out painting on the weekends, and Camille Pissarro becomes his first teacher. In 1882, the stock market crashes. He loses his job. He moves to Copenhagen, where his wife is from, for a little bit. He doesn't like living with his wife's relatives. He doesn't want to learn the language. So he abandons his family, comes back to France. And from that moment on, he is a full-time painter, not successful financially, just like Van Gogh. He doesn't sell a lot during his lifetime. He, like Cezanne, participates in the Impressionist exhibitions multiple times, but he's very different from the Impressionists, even though he's supported by Degas. Degas likes what he does. He then spends some time in this rural area of France, in the north of France and Brittany, then in Pont-Aven. He travels to Panama and Martinique. He's an earl with Van Gogh in the south of France. And then from 1890, we mostly associate him with Polynesia. He moves to Tahiti because it's cheaper to live there, and because he likes this idea of being this sort of scandalous exile from France. Life is hard. He doesn't really sort of enjoy it as much as he wanted to, because at heart, he is a French colonial. He's not really a Tahitian, as much he likes to sort of attempt to construct that image. How do we recognize Gauguin? So if you see a 19th century artist who has ghosts and primitivist looking idols and these very simplified images with really bright colors, with flattened out shapes, that's Gauguin. His enduring theme is that of spirituality, but in a different way than Van Gogh. Van Gogh is very much part of Christian theology, for that he doesn't sort of give us literal symbolism. Gauguin takes Christian symbolism and remixes it with his own personal symbols, with the Tahitian mythology, with the Javanese dancers, and he wants to create this new language of symbolism. That is his sort of lasting theme that he wants to give us. He appropriates, that's a fashionable word, from a bunch of cultures without understanding them. And he creates these very hybrid objects that are very difficult to decipher because they come from different traditions. And you have to know, you have to have read Gauguin's letters to understand their significance to him. So this is the painting, which is here at the National Gallery of Art. This is from 1889, self-portrait with halo and snake. And this is where he starts really to develop this new symbolic language that he wants to be a universal symbolic language. This is his idea of representing himself as Christ and savage, as martyr and a visionary. So it's really flat. There is no sort of attempt to create an illusion of depth or volume. It's very brightly saturated colors. You have a red and yellow sections, and you have this disembodied head that he borrows from a Byzantine icon. You have a halo on top of his head, the apples of the temptation of Adam and Eve. And in his hand, he's holding a snake, right? Another element from the temptation and fall. And there he is floating in the center with the halo. So sort of these binary juxtaposing attributes that present him as saint and Lucifer, Adam and Eve, visionary and savage, because the way that he paints is very much against the grain of 19th century painting. So Christian religious symbolism is there. You have to, he's a Catholic, he's educated as a Catholic, he understands the iconography. And he's also looking at the Japanese ukiyo-e. There are these flattened out, saturated areas of color bound by very strong outlines. He calls the style Cloisonnism, the style that he also sort of appropriated, stole from his colleague, and that's borrowed from the medieval enamels or from the stained glass windows, where you have this very thick black suturing between the areas of color. So this is a very famous painting by Gauguin. This is The Spirit of the Dead Watching. He also gives it a Tahitian title of Manau Tupapau. This is at the Albert Knox Art Gallery, 1892. And so there we have the new Christ. Here we have the new Eve. This Eve is different in the history of art of the West because she's not white. This is this sort of huge change that Gauguin introduces into painting, into reinterpretation of the traditional figures and traditional shapes and forms. And what he's doing here is he's looking at his predecessor, an avant-garde leader by the name of Edouard Manet, and his Olympia, which is on the bottom from 1862. So he takes Manet's modern nude, which is this huge, long-lasting tradition in Western art, the reclining nude. We can count its appearance from Venetian Renaissance, from Giorgione and Titian. Manet reinterprets it in his Olympia on the bottom of your screen. And what Gauguin does is he sort of says, I am the new avant-garde leader. I will reference Manet. I will defer to Manet as the creator of the modern nude. And then I will flip-flop Manet. I will inverse the position of the body on the bed, and I will reverse the color of the skin. So in Monet, you famously have a white woman who is nude, reclining on the bed, and you have the black servant bringing her the flowers of a suitor. And she is, of course, this modern urban type, the prostitute, which is a pervasive type in the 19th century society where sex is commercialized and consumed by the middle-class flaneur. What you have in Gauguin, you have a Tahitian woman in the Tahitian setting, and instead of a servant, you have the spirit of the dead watching. She is actually, this is not an actual room, this is not an actual sort of episode in her life. She is dreaming, she's having a nightmare. We know this because Gauguin describes the genesis of this painting in his diary. He describes that he had come into the room and scared his Vahini, his Tahitian partner, and she thought he was a Tupapau, the spirit of the dead. And in Gauguin, you can always tell when we are looking at the vision or a fantasy because you have these floating flowers in the background to indicate that this is not reality that is happening. So you have the different skin color, you have the specter as a viewer, and you have the flowers as a dream. And this is what a post-impressionist take on the nude is. It's this very symbolist, very sort of metaphysical take on this old tradition. The last painting I'm going to show you by Gauguin is what he calls his gospel. This is at the MFA in Boston. This is called Where Do We Come From? What are we? Where are we going? And Gauguin says this is his masterpiece and I shall never do anything better or even like it. So the interpretation of this painting, if you're going off of his letters and off of his biography, links to his education at the cemetery where they studied this catechism, which was put together by the Bishop of Orleans. And the catechism had certain questions that you had to contemplate as a student. Where does humanity come from? Where is it going to? How does humanity proceed? So basically the same sort of things that Gauguin is using in the title of his painting. So we have the new Christ, we have the new Eve, this is the new gospel. And you read it because we are in Tahiti and because Gauguin is very conscious of how he's changing everything, inversing and reversing, you have to read it, not wait, how do we read right to left? Wait, no, you have to read it the opposite of the way that we read, slightly dyslexic here, because it's in a non-Western way of reading. You have to read it in the opposite way. And you also read it in a circle. So you have to start here with this new nativity, right? There is a baby over here and 3 women with the child. This is how life begins, right? Motherhood and children. You then proceed to this youth in the center of the painting, and it's a fairly androgynous youth, and he is picking up, or she is picking up, an apple from the tree. What is the obvious reference here? To Adam and Eve again, right? So from nativity to the fall, you then go to the girl with an apple who is dressed. So from the nudity or semi-nudity, you are now in this instance where she knows shame, right? Again, it's the biblical reference. After the fall, after you know shame, you start to cover your body. And it also is a reference to the missionaries in Tahiti that were changing the Tahitian society and dressing them in these sort of shapeless bags of dresses. So she's biting an apple. Then, so there's a goat and 2 cats. All of these are traditional symbols of lust, as we know from traditional Western iconography. We then move to this woman who is sitting in the pose of a Venus, right? She's a beautiful young woman. So she stands for beauty and sexuality. And then she turns into this older woman with the white bird. And there's a quote by Gauguin who says, this is an old woman who approaches death and appears reconciled and resigned to her thoughts. So this is old age and death. And the white bird stands for the uselessness of vain words. So all the compliments that's been paid to this beauty in her youth are useless, a trash, right? When you stand at the brink of death. And then you have to go backwards in a circle to come to this blue idol in the background. There is a priestess next to it. This is actually Hina, the goddess of the moon, who asks the Tefatu, or the head deity of Tahitian pantheon, for humanity's immortality, and she is refused. So Gauguin describes this as the beyond. And then we move by peacock. Peacocks are symbols of immortality. We move to a different tree over here, the other tree that has this bright foliage like the tree of the fall over here, the tree of knowledge with Adam and Eve. It's parallel to the tree of signs. That's how Gauguin describes it. And he says these 2 figures in purple behind the second tree dare to think of their destiny, because in the 19th century, there's such a development of scientific invention and research. There is, the common idea that science can predict the future, right? Jules Verne is writing all of these science fiction books. So these are people, scientists or scholars walking by the tree of knowledge, and they are looked at by this seated nude who has a hand over an arm over her head. And Gauguin says she stares in astonishment upon these 2 because life doesn't follow the plan. And then you have the dog on the very edge of the painting. Dogs and wolves are personal symbols of Gauguin. So there it is, the sort of the circle of life, and also his philosophy. The way to decipher all of Gauguin's paintings is to know Gauguin's paintings, because each figure in this painting comes from a different painting by Gauguin. There is the idol that he puts here. There is a man with an axe that becomes the androgynous youth. The Adam and Eve from Paradise Lost become the 2 scientists over here. The woman that looks at them is the Ondine that drowns herself in the sea because she is overwhelmed by the forces of nature. There is no predictable future. There is the fox, or the dog of the wolf, that stands for Gauguin. There is Vairumati, the queen of beauty that we see over here. And Vairumati and the older woman are together in life and death, another of Gauguin's paintings. So Gauguin truly has developed this very personal alphabet that you need to know to be able to read his paintings. And for him, this is the enduring thing that he does, which is not a fleeting moment, that will stay in the history of art. Our last artist is Paul Cézanne. And again, a completely different painter, a completely different take on representation, and the most complicated one in terms of explanation. So stay with me here. So Cézanne is an incredibly intellectual figure. He is not just an accomplished painter, he actually goes to law school. So he is a strange man, but a very educated one, a great reader, a great friend of Émile Zola. They are childhood friends. They have a falling out, but it really doesn't matter. So he is from Ailly, this sort of rural area of France, a lot of mountains and woods. He comes to Paris. He works with Camille Pissarro. He submits to the Salon, the official establishment exhibitionary space. During the Franco-Prussian War, he moves away from Paris to L'Estaque near Marseille, and he paints together with Renoir, and he exhibits with the Impressionists. So he doesn't really consider himself a revolutionary in any way. He is financially supported by his father, who is a difficult man, but Cézanne does get a stipend. After his father's death, he inherits the estate. He marries his long-suffering partner, Hortense. When in 1895, he becomes incredibly popular and incredibly successful, and people start to look for him, he gets very depressed by this development, and he, already a loner, becomes completely isolated. He doesn't like people. He famously has a phobia of children touching him. So, you know, none of them are really very mentally, you know, exemplary. Let's put it that way. So he paints everything. He paints figures, he paints landscapes, he paints still lifes, he paints nudes. Mostly, I think, we know him as a still life painter and a landscape painter. So that's what I'm going to show you today. His quote that I have here can stand for the whole of the movement of post-impressionism. He says, "I want to make of impressionism something solid and lasting, like the art in the museums." That is the challenge. That is the difference. That is the problem the post-impressionists have with impressionism. They don't like the here and gone second of light that Monet is capturing, for example, at sunset for 3 minutes. So he rejects this ephemerality, and what you have in Cézanne is a structured world, is a constructed world. We're going to talk about this, and he uses color to sort of put the Lego together, to put his world together. It is a world that it has a very definitive composition. It's very structured, and it is a world that is observed from nature. But it is also a world that is subjective, because he's a post-impressionist. So it is a world simplified, a world informed by memory as much as it is informed by nature that he is seeing. So the most famous thing that Cézanne does is he simplifies everything to geometry. He says, treat nature by the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. So these are the building blocks. So one of the most sort of frequently painted things in Cézanne's body of work is this Mountain Saint-Victoire, which is, this one is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, 1904-1906. And what you have to see here in this painting, what you have to realize is that when you look at a painting like this by Cézanne, you are watching the process of world being constructed. It is a world in the process of becoming. And that process of becoming is a duration of time. Okay, so this is not a finished product. We are observing as things are being built. There is time passing. So I will sort of talk about this. You have what we call, or you can call, pictorial units. So like building blocks, like Legos, right? And these Legos you put together and you create space over time by building up, right? You take units and you make them into complex fields. What do I mean by this? If you look at this landscape, we have sort of patches, right? You see that. Patches of color, the repetitive uniform brushwork. They build and build and build, and they create spaces, and they create shapes, and then they create the whole of the landscape. But they are done brick by brick. So that building up process takes time, and that is the feeling that is conveyed by Cézanne to his viewer. Because of the way that he builds his worlds, right? Because of this constructivist space, there is no perspective, really, right? Because any perspective, which is a point of view you take to capture a scene, is only possible when you stand in one particular spot. If things are being constructed and time is passing, you have multiple points of views, multiple scenes that sort of merge together. Okay? Now, how do they merge together? So these are complicated things, but I'm hoping we can also discuss them so you can get them better. How do they merge together? It has to do with this concept of stereoscopy, which is very famous in the 19th century. And when I was a kid, we had these little postcards where you would turn them and they would become three-dimensional. That's the stereoscopy in action. We look at the world with two eyes, right? If you close one eye, you see a world a little bit differently than if you close it and open the other eye. So because we don't have a monocular vision, we have a binocular vision. When we see with two eyes, we simultaneously perceive from different angles. That is what allows us as human beings to perceive volume and depth. That is what Cézanne is giving us. Because a conventional painting, it's as though you're looking at the world with one eye. What Cézanne is giving us is the merging of two, but he's also giving us a process of that merging. Okay, hopefully it will become a little easier to understand with examples. The true experience of sight, says Cézanne, is a combination of touch, memory, and time passing. So the first is sight as touch. When you are looking at an object, when you're looking at an apple, you're not just looking at an apple, you also have this idea of what an apple would feel like. That's how babies learn, right? They need to touch things. So we know the world, even when we're just looking without touching, we know the world because we have touched an object. That's how our vision is also completed. Einstein, who is working on his theory about this time, 1905, says that the experience of space consists of relationships of mutual contact, right? We understand space because things touch each other, or we have touched things. So that's the way that we experience the physicality around us. The way that Cézanne indicates it for us is where objects touch is emphasized by color. if you look closely at his apples, every touch is emphasized, is highlighted for us. That is how we sort of, when you look at these two apples, you feel that they are touching because he has presented that to us in this way. This lived perspective, right? Because we're talking about seeing as living, as touching. It's also memory and movement and time. What we are seeing here, just as he's in his landscape, we are seeing things from different perspectives. We're seeing this basket of apples as though we have moved around the scene, as though we have picked up each apple and looked at it. And so we are given each object from multiple perspectives. We're given a complete experience and vision of each object. An object we have touched, an object we remember, and an object that we moved around of. When we're moving around, time has passed. So we are basically, he's giving us viewing in time. It's the whole, he's giving us the whole deal, the comprehensive nature of viewing. Time has passed since we've been looking. He is giving us the whole of the object and also the time passing. And that time passing is because we've moved. I am repeating myself, but this is important to remember because this is my last slide. So this is a diagram of how Cezanne represents things. So there is another basket of apples here, right? And this is the way that we are showing it. So we're looking at this basket from over here. That's why we're seeing the front of the basket, right? Because we're standing here. Then we have moved, let's say, over here, and we're looking at this fruit as though we're looking at it from this angle because we have moved. So if you look at this diagram and then match it to the painting, you will understand why we're getting different perspectives, because we have moved, because time has passed. So a person cannot capture what they're seeing instantly. That's an illusion. When you are coming to a cluttered writing table and you look in it, you think you have seen everything on the surface, pens, papers, glasses, cups of coffee, right? Whatever detritus you have on your desk, or I have on my desk, potted plants. You think you've captured it instantaneously. That's an illusion, right? Time has passed. Our brain has processed things one at a time. And what we get is a memory, right? We get a memory and we think we now understand this. Okay? So he's giving us each moment as it happens. That's why his paintings look fragmented, because each moment in time is a little bit different than the other and has a little bit different of a viewpoint. These are the ruptures. So he had purposely fragmented the image, destroyed the unity to give us total vision, to give us the idea of how vision works, which is what made Cezanne revolutionary, which is why we will later have Cubism that will go off of this idea and truly fragment everything.